Today, solar PPAs. Welcome to the Solar Podcast. I'm your host, Tim Montague. Today, my guest is Micah Sussman, Head of Project Origination for New Resource Solutions, a solar finance company. Welcome to the show, Micah.
Hey, thanks for having me, Tim.
I have tried to sell many a PPA and have been so far unsuccessful. So I'm hoping that you could give me some tips and tricks today to get some of my PPA projects across the finish line. But tell our viewers and listeners how you got interested in renewable energy, Micah.
Oh, wow. So I've actually been in the energy industry just in general for about 10 years now. I did a master's of energy systems engineering, focusing on renewables and storage. And then I used that to make the leap into a PhD in materials engineering, working on energy storage devices. And after that grueling process, I decided I wanted something a little faster pace. And so I got into consulting with a boutique firm called Woodlawn Associates. We work primarily with solar companies. We focused on development and new market strategy. We worked with a lot of names that you've heard of. And that actually transitioned into project finance, tax equity, a lot of advisory work for both developers, investors, even some utilities. And then that was really where I cut my teeth on project finance. We transitioned again to become a residential solar company when Illinois its residential market blew up. And I was the head of operations for them. And like any startup solar company, that meant I was on roofs installing, I was running the warehouse, procurement, managing logistics, cleaning the warehouse on Saturdays, all that stuff. And I eventually decided I wanted to get back into more B2B stuff. And I left and went to work for myself for a little bit. I did some transaction advisory, and I actually developed a couple of my own systems before I linked up with New Resource Solutions, which is where I'm heading up project origination now.
Awesome. Well, it's great that you have a background in energy storage, because that is going to be very useful in the coming decades as we start to see more and more hybrid solutions pairing solar and storage together. And it's truly just, we're just scratching the surface here. So that's going to be a wild ride. Have you guys done any solar and storage projects yet?
I personally have. When I was with Woodlawn Associates, we did a couple of projects that had it tacked on. And then when I was working for myself, I did some structuring for a friend of mine who is down in Hawaii, where everything is solar plus storage. New Resource Solutions, we've seen a lot of solar plus storage. We're still working on getting one over the hump, but part of it is, and you know from being in this industry, that C&I projects just take forever to get going. I can tell you that every single day I'm talking to somebody about storage, because it's there. It's an exciting topic. They all want to do it. So.
Yep. Well, tell our listeners a little more about New Resource Solutions. I've gotten to know you, and we've kicked the tires on a few opportunities, but give us the bigger picture and the types of projects that you're going after.
Yeah, absolutely. So New Resource Solutions, or NRS, it's a mouthful to keep saying New Resource Solutions. So NRS, we like to think of ourselves as an accelerator for C&I project finance. So we're focused on commercial, industrial, non-residential, non-utility, PPA finance. We work with installers and developers. We work with the investors, but our role is really to accelerate the financing process through standardization, transparent communication, and a guided process. And we also focus on growing the market by unlocking financing for some of the smaller projects that traditionally have been ignored, and empower installers across the US to finance projects. Today, only about 20% of installers are financing projects. and either they've done it before and had such a bad experience that they've stayed away from it, or they've never done it before and they either don't know how to go about it or they don't know who to go to. And so we sit in the middle and can try to change both of those. So for the installer who's had a bad experience, we work to connect with an investor who's not just good for the project, but good for the company, so that we can foster long-term relationships that make financing simpler, easier. And we're there in the process to help be a buttress against any bad feelings that come out of that. And there's always something that happens in a transaction that having somebody there in the middle who can be there to talk to about it, who can be there to have a conversation with the investor, who can be there to do this, that, or the other, it helps, and it lubricates the process enough that things move smoothly and we don't have as many problems.
Very good. Very good. So let's just get into it. What is a solar PPA, which is a power purchase agreement? How does it work? And what is the difference that a PPA makes for customers?
Yeah, so if you give me a second, I'm going to share my screen here because I've got a nice little diagram. Let me know if you can see that.
Yes.
Perfect. So a solar PPA it's similar to the contract you have with your utility, right? So the difference being that rather than having it tied to the electricity you pull from the grid, you're tied to the electricity that's coming from the system. Generally speaking, the PPA says that you, the customer, will use and pay for all the electricity that comes from the system at a price given in the contract. That's a fixed price, and that may change over time, but it's changing at a known rate, which is very different from the utility. The way it works is essentially, like I said, you have production coming from the system. That production gets measured on a regular basis, and the customer gets invoiced for it. It's a surprisingly simple contract for how long they can be. For the customer, it's often that they're able to save some amount off of the utility price. When you buy a solar system for cash, you get 100% of the savings that are associated with that system, but you pay for the system up front and have to be capable of using the tax benefits. Under a PPA, an investor comes in and owns the system and operates the system. They pay for the installation of the system, and then they are able to turn around and charge the customer for the power, often at a discount to the grid rate. And so in many cases, the customer is saving significant money for no money up front. And in some places, depending on the system, we've seen cases where a customer is able to lock in a rate and fix that rate at some number for 25, even 30 years. And those things are valuable both to the customer and to getting the system sold and installed.
Yeah, it seems to me like there's a trade-off, and there's risk and there's reward. And the higher the risk for the customer, if they were to be able to buy the system outright for themselves, right, they're taking more risk in the entire process and then throughout the life cycle of the project, and the reward is higher.
Yeah.
If they lower that risk factor and do third-party ownership, which is another way to refer to a PPA, then it's a much lower risk. There's very little capital outlay on the front end. There is, some involvement. They have to walk through the development of the project and the contract, of course. So it's not without its challenges, but then the reward is also a little lower for the customer. But like you said, they're getting a discount on the power that they're buying. If they're a large buyer of power, this can be tens or hundreds of thousands of dollars a year. The example I've given on this channel most recently is the Parkland College project, which we did not build. It's just a project in my backyard here in Champaign, and Parkland College is saving $20,000 to $30,000 per year with a solar array that they don't own, that Con Ed owns and operates, and they are just buying the power from it.
Absolutely. No, absolutely. Um, it's one of those things where, it really depends on what your goals are, right? And it's not just, it doesn't have to be any specific type of customer either. There are customers who fit better in a PPA because their goals align better with a PPA. There are customers who fit better under a cash purchase because the goals align better under a cash purchase. And, you know, I always, when I talk to developers, I always give them the same answer, which is when you get into a PPA, you know, just in general, it's different from selling a system for cash. You're adding more parties to the mix. You've got a lot of stuff that needs to be fully diligenced, and there's a process you go through and all of that stuff. But at the end of the day, that may be the right way to sell that system. Now, granted, if you sell it for cash, you've got a two-party transaction. Things move very smoothly because it's you and your customer who you have the relationship with directly, et cetera. And our goal is to help facilitate these transactions enough so that a three-party transaction, a PPA, where you've got a customer, an investor, and a developer, is as simple as having a two-party transaction.
Sure. So what are some examples? You mentioned being able to use the tax incentives, for example. So what are some examples of organizations that prefer PPAs versus direct ownership?
Yeah, I'll change my slide. So any organization could use a PPA over purchasing the system for cash. There's nothing that says you have to be in this box. Companies like Google, Walmart, Target, FedEx, they've all entered into PPAs for hundreds of megawatts, or in the case of Google, like 5.5 gigawatts of PPA solar. It's just the way that they want to do it. And, these companies they're not set up to operate solar systems, that especially the ones like Google is buying large scale solar, hundreds of megawatts at a time. They don't want to operate those. They'd rather have some other group operate them, and they pay for the power. But also, we've seen over 10,000 schools have solar through PPAs. Municipalities are going solar, or they've committed to going solar by a certain date. They can't use the tax benefits, so they automatically are prime customers for a PPA. Nonprofits are an obvious choice for PPAs. Again, they can't use the tax benefits. In fact, we're working with a nonprofit housing development organization and a number of religious institutions right now on projects. And they're all through, obviously, if they're working with us, they're all through PPAs. And if I were to put together a list of key deciding factors, it's really that there are no upfront costs, and they can fix their costs to a predictable schedule for 20 to 25, even 30 years. They have no desire to operate and maintain the system themselves, whether they have the capability to do it or not. They just don't want to do it. It's extra work for them. They can't monetize the tax benefits, and they want to have an off-balance sheet contract. So I should caveat this by saying that there are some things that could keep a customer from being able to use a PPA, namely poor corporate credit. But there are sometimes ways around that. So that is something to think about.
Or geography, right?
Or geography. You're right. There are some places where third-party ownership just still isn't allowed.
Like Indiana.
Like Florida, which at the commercial level, I think Sunrun has somehow made it possible to do a lease at the residential level. But Florida is a perfect example where they decided that you can't do a PPA unless you're a regulated utility. And so rather than everybody becoming regulated utilities, they just don't do PPAs.
Sure. So you mentioned, nonprofits, religious organizations, schools, municipalities, and then any private company can also leverage this and oftentimes do. It is interesting that companies like Google and Walmart, who theoretically have resources out the wazoo and could certainly own and operate, but they choose to do PPAs for other reasons. It is administratively certainly less cumbersome. It's off balance sheet, so that may be a factor. But they're missing out on that 26% ITC, which is a significant benefit of a purchase. So it is fascinating to see who decides to do this and who doesn't. Um, what else do you want to say about the types of organizations or customers? We just touched on jurisdictions. I mean, do you see other geographic trends, I guess?
Yeah. So I would say that there are, so let's go back actually to jurisdictions and states that aren't allowing PPAs or third-party ownership in general. There are states that have disallowed it. If you wanted to do a PPA, you're really stuck doing it with the utility. There are like Indiana has, there are people who are doing PPAs. They're all just with the utility. They're not big systems, but they're doing them with the utility. But other than that, you can't do these behind the meter PPAs that we see in other states. There are states that have straight up banned it, but there are lots of groups working to change this. We see the PPA being most popular in the key solar states. Out west, pretty much anywhere. California, especially, that's the solar state. But we're seeing it pretty much anywhere north of Virginia. I've got projects that I've looked at everywhere from Maryland. DC is an interesting market. Massachusetts, Maine. Now that Maine's opened up their net metering, things are flowing like crazy out there. Nobody would have thought of Maine as being a solar state, but nobody thought of Illinois as being a solar state. The Midwest is pretty hot too. We've got PPAs in Illinois, Ohio, Michigan, you name it. There are some states in the Midwest that don't allow the PPA specifically, but we can get around that with a service agreement. And that's usually what we would use in a place like Missouri, where they do allow you to do third-party ownership. They just won't allow you to do it under a PPA.
So what is that? You mentioned Missouri, no PPA, but what? It's a
We would
lease
use
or
a service agreement. Some people call it a solar service agreement. Some people call it an energy service agreement. It's kind of a blend between a PPA and an equipment lease. It's a fixed payment, but there's often a performance guarantee against it, where the PPA is tied to however much electricity you produce is what you're getting paid for. And so that connects the incentive between the customer and the investor, where the investor's got to make their return based on the amount of electricity they produce, and the customer wants all that electricity. The energy service agreement or solar service agreement is, we expect this to come out of the system. We've priced it at a certain rate. That gives you a fixed number of X per month. And then we have an annual or semi-annual or biannual, depends on who's structuring the service agreement, true up on production that makes sure that you're producing what you're supposed to be producing.
okay.
Yeah.
We're going to give some examples, get some case studies on the table here, but what are the nuts and bolts of a PPA agreement to begin with?
So the key thing that a customer needs to know about a PPA is that they have 3 responsibilities. Number 1 is pay for the electricity generated each month at the current PPA rate, so pay their bills. Number 2 is allow the system owner access to maintain and operate the system. And number 3 is don't do anything that would stop you from doing numbers 1 and 2. And I say that kind of tongue in cheek, but if you look at the contract itself, the contract really outlines the price and the term of the contract. And then it tells the customer that they need to pay their bills and give access to the owner for maintenance. And then everything else in that contract discusses the responsibilities of the owner of the system to operate and maintain the system, and what happens if either the owner or the customer fails to do something they're supposed to do. It's really, when you boil down a PPA, it's a really simple contract. There's just a lot of legalese in it. And really, it's if the customer is comfortable with the PPA rate and they understand why they need to give access to the owner of the system to operate it on their behalf, most of it is pretty straightforward and boilerplate. So, it looks a lot more daunting when you get a 50, 60 page PPA, but most of that is, here's what you're supposed to do and what happens if it doesn't happen.
Yeah, I would agree. It is very straightforward. Just like when you sign up to get utility service, right? You're telling the utility, you sell me electricity, I'll buy it, I'll pay the bill. If I don't pay the bill, you have the right to eventually stop serving me. They probably have to jump through some hoops to turn off residential service, but electricity is a mission critical service for everybody, and so
Yeah.
it's just an additional bill, right?
Yeah.
And like any other bill, you're adding a service to your portfolio of services, and it's pretty straightforward. So why don't we give our audience some examples? Do you have some case studies?
Yeah, absolutely. So I have two different systems that represent a lot of the work that we do on a regular basis. The first one is actually a portfolio of community solar systems in New York. These are large systems. They require a lot of development work before they can close. But actually, one of these systems is on a capped landfill, and we are trying to do ballasted single axis trackers. So not only is this system big and requires a lot of development work, but now it's complicating itself because in order to make it financially viable, we want to do it with the trackers and get the extra production and get all this extra stuff. But it's a capped landfill, so you can't penetrate the ground. And so how do you do that? You do it with ballast. And I can tell you there are not that many ballasted tracker systems, and even fewer that are on capped landfills. And so because we're dealing with a portfolio of systems that all had the same required diligence items and development items, and it was a lot. We started out by trying to standardize the process, and we did it simply by providing a naming convention for these guys that allowed them to have each item has the same file name for the same type of file, and then it only changes the system name. And now this seems like something that's so basic and simple, but when you're then taking that and populating it directly into a data room, it really helped make it easier for both the developer and the investor to find files, be notified that there's a file in there, and know exactly where to go to do the diligence. In fact, we had a call a couple of days ago, a checking call, and they asked, was this document in there for this system? And the engineer who was on the phone said, oh yeah, it was right in the folder. We got it. It was no problem. Everything was labeled easily. We found it right away. That saves us so much time and effort when we're trying to work with an investor who's standardized their own process. But now we can take that and make it so that the developer who has to work within that doesn't struggle to figure out, well, where does this go and where does that go? And how should I label this one for this project, et cetera? Everything is standardized, it's simple, and things move a lot smoother. With this project, we also helped the developer communicate some of the status of the diligence items and get required information together for the investor. The hardest part was obviously dealing with the trackers on the landfill.
You can't show a site diagram, can you? We'd love to see what that looks like.
I wish. But there's actually, so in Beloit, there is a ballasted tracker system on a landfill if you ever want to go see it.
Oh,
But yeah, we had to put together a case for doing trackers on landfill, ballasted. The investor was able to give me a call, have a discussion with me, talking about what they need to get it past their investment committee. That allowed me to turn around and have a discussion with the developer, answer their questions, put a plan together. The investor didn't feel like they were teaching the developer didn't feel like they were being pushed around by the investor. We put several documents together, high quality documents together, and the investor was able to get it approved through their engineering, and they're positive about their investment committee pushing towards a close. And so, that little bit of help, being able to work with these guys, talk through, well, these are the details you need to get. These are the details you don't need to go digging for. This is going to be impossible to find. This is the level of diligence these guys need. That helped assuage some of the stress that comes with being asked to put together a case study on several other ballasted tracker systems, or get a plan together to de-risk the idea that these could have problems in the New York area, where you can imagine they get snow and there's frost, and that could move the system around a lot.
and this is not a behind the meter project, is that right? Or
This is a community solar project. So this is about a 6.5 megawatt project. This is a larger system than we're usually dealing with.
Mhm.
We've worked on some behind the meter systems with these guys, but
But how many off takers in the community solar arrangement?
It's probably close to 100. They have one anchor, and then they're going to go residential for the rest of it. So it's small chunks. It may be even higher than 100. But there's also 3 other systems in this portfolio that are all going to be the same. Those are luckily not on landfills and can be done standard.
So, I think the differences are probably subtle, but community solar at face value, I know it best here in Illinois, where you set up a central array and then you register subscribers who are buying power via virtual net metering. What makes it a PPA per se? And is every community solar project a PPA by definition?
So not every community solar project is a PPA by definition. There are 2 types that I would say don't qualify. One is the community solar that's owned by the utility, where they sell it to you for a premium. That isn't community solar in my mind, but they call it that. The other is a community solar system where, rather than having a subscription agreement, which is a PPA by any other name, you have an ownership in the project. So you own 3 kilowatts of the 2 megawatt project, or you own 7 kilowatts of that. And you own that number of panels, and you pay for that portion of it, and you get all of the benefit of it. You don't have to pay a bill on top of that. Those are rare. Those were one of the strategies. That was one of the strategies used early on with community solar, but they've all shifted, as far as I understand, they've all shifted to a subscription agreement, which is it's a PPA for the electricity coming off of that system. You just happen to be subscribed to a specific system. The other case study I have is a more traditional PPA. It's a behind the meter system, and it's actually a portfolio of small systems that averaged about 40 kilowatts that are actually currently under construction, and these are in Massachusetts, and it's with the Affordable Housing Development Organization. And so this one was tough because we had so many moving pieces, and we had staggered timelines, and we had to manage a lot of documents. And it started out with transparent communication and helping to guide the process. And what I mean by that is we provided a structure for both the investor and the developer to connect on a regular basis, have questions and issues discussed as they arose, and troubleshoot and provide intros to third parties as needed regarding things like technical support, O&M quotes, insurance, everything. We even when we safe harbored this and we got that done, we helped them get that done because we had a little bit more experience on what the safe harbor options were. And so we connected them up with a supplier that was willing to do some extra warehousing. You have to understand that there were close to 20 sites in this portfolio. So that meant a ton of documents. I mean, a ton of documents. Like every single site had its own PPA and it had its own site lease and it had its own, there was one EPC agreement, but there were exhibits to that, et cetera.
Give us some more high level on this though. Are we talking rooftop solar? What state?
All rooftop solar.
And where geographically?
The Boston area. And some of it was penetrating rooftop, some of it was ballasted rooftop. There was a mix. But in order to get the investor and their financing parties comfortable with this, we had to standardize the process and make sure that every site had the required docs. It was all organized the exact same way.
But the host is a single company that has multiple facilities, or
the host is, it's a single company that owns these buildings.
Yeah.
And and of course, to make it more complicated, they own these buildings within their own separate LLCs. And then those LLCs are highly leveraged. And so we needed to have a guarantee against the PPA because the LLCs themselves were not considered creditworthy, but the parent organization is creditworthy. And so we were able to get that to go. And then each LLC individually signed a PPA with the investor. So it was complicated, absolutely complicated, because there are just a lot of moving parts.
And can you say anything about the savings though that the PPA generated for the host?
Yeah, so these were under the Mass Smart program. And so that program has a feed-in tariff and a value of energy. And so the feed-in tariff subtracted out the value of energy. That's the amount you get directly from the utility. And then the value of energy is what you take the PPA against. And so these guys were actually under an interesting structure where the ones that were, that had the PPA against them were a floating PPA on the value of energy. And so they said, okay, well, we'll give you a 10% discount to the value of energy as described. And as that changes over time, that 10% will stay. And that's how we're going to make this work. And that the numbers worked out because whatever the difference between the value of energy and the total is, that's the feed-in tariff that you're guaranteed from the utility. So that also acted as a credit enhancer because the utility is investment grade credit.
Okay. Anything else you want to say about the case studies?
Honestly, a lot of what I talk about it sounds very administrative, and honestly, it is very administrative, but that administrative work is critical to bringing sanity to the process.
Yeah, we need to talk about some of the nuts and bolts though, like the roof condition.
Yeah.
What are things that hosts are going to deal with? Well, it's both the hosts and the installer / developer, the creditworthiness, other risk factors. Let's talk through some of that stuff.
So let's start with the hosts, because the hosts are a little simpler. They need to, if they're getting a rooftop system, they need to have a roof that can support it. And that's not going to need a replacement like 5 years into a 25-year system. That just affects all of the value here. They also
10 years old or less is the rule of thumb we use. What do you have a different rule of thumb?
No, I think 10 years is probably right. I was being extreme on purpose, but yeah, I mean, if you just got a brand new roof last year, you're a good candidate for a rooftop system. As the installer and the developer, the way you would look at a roof for a cash system, it should be the same way you look at a roof for a PPA system. You will, and some places don't require it for the construction, but if you're putting a system on a roof on a PPA, you're definitely going to need stamped structural calculations. It's just a requirement that these investors want. They want to know that when they're owning this system for 20 years, that they're not going to have a problem with the roof caving in. But just in general, that's a good rule of thumb. But making sure that roof is fine, that it's good. From the customer standpoint, also, if you can get corporate debt, you can usually get a PPA. I say usually. I don't want to make a blanket statement about customer credit, but as the installer, when you're going after customers, understanding their credit, their financial status, their stability, because stability is a huge part of this. That's going to be big for being able to get the system financed. And we've talked about it before, that customer credit is a big piece of this. But I feel like there's a lot more for the installer to keep in mind than there is for the customer to keep in mind. And I think there are 4 key things that I would touch on for the installer to understand. Are things that we look at when we're talking about finance. Number 1 is customer credit. Always customer credit. Unless they're rated or a government or municipal entity, you need to get financials as soon as possible if you think you have a real deal. This is often the biggest hurdle in most projects, and it's often the biggest hurdle when working with the customer. So if you let them know that you're going to need financials at some point during this process, it often makes it move smoother. The other thing is roofing work. Very little roofing can actually be included in the ITC. Usually we say it's 0% unless you've got something like a bifacial module where you're replacing an asphalt roof with white TPO. Then you can include the difference between a re-roof with asphalt and the roof with TPO. But roofing costs, you can include them in the financing even if they're not eligible for the ITC, but it affects the PPA rate, or it affects the purchase price of the system. And generally investors are okay if this is like 10% of the cost, but they don't want to see a roofing cost that's 50% of the price of the system. That's the biggest one. I see that a lot. And we're very upfront with people. We say to them, look, we see a big roofing cost in here. This is not going to be treated as ITC eligible. Be prepared for that to affect pricing. And if it does, it does. And we talk about it, and we talk about structures that can work, et cetera. But that's a big stumbling block for rooftop systems. The other thing that's a big stumbling block is often understanding what the key development items are. And in the blog post we just wrote, we walk through what those items are and how an investor diligences rooftop and ground mount systems. And so we always say to make sure you know what you're getting into. Sometimes with small systems, some of these items can be brushed past, but it's better to know what you need to do to get a system financed than to go in blind and get caught off guard. And
what are you referring to? I don't know what you're talking about.
So we wrote a blog post that talks about this whole topic. What is a PPA? What does the financing process look like? And in that, we talk about what does the diligence process look like? And part of that diligence process is the investor reviewing all of the key development items. So when you've got a ground mount, for example, some of those key development items are an ALTA, an environmental survey, cultural in some cases, title, all of that stuff. And so being prepared to do that work, to get those reports done, et cetera, that's key, because those cost money. Those cost money to the developer and the installer. If you have to do a geotechnical pull test, that costs money, and it's often required, especially for large ground mounts, 500 kilowatts and above. They're often going to say we need to see this. And so just going in knowing what the development items are and the development expenses are.
Here's that blog post you mentioned. with a nice graphic: origination, development and diligence, construction, operations, and
Then you
so
go down and you have my giant table. And that's all the those are all the development items that are going to get diligenced.
yep.
And also, we should note that on this and the previous blog post about what is a PPA, we have the slides that I was referring to earlier. Those are available for installers, developers. Those are supposed to be customer facing so that you can help walk through all of this stuff with the customer. Let them know what the process is. Let them know this is it's a fairly complicated process compared to just give us cash and we'll give you a system. But it's there to help answer questions, to help explain things a little bit more simply. We're taking our experience and adding it into the mix here.
Can we talk a little bit about ground mount and because developing ground mount solar, we love ground mount, but it is more complicated from a permitting perspective. You have to this third row here, environmental is a big chunk of stuff that costs real money to get through. How do you pay for all of this?
So you often are going out of pocket, but there are definitely investors out there who have development funds specifically for helping get through a lot of this. There are ways to do it where you can take out financing directly for the company who's doing the development. We have investor clients that we work with that provide development capital. So there is money out there to help do this, but often much of this is done at risk by the developer, unless they are able to get the investor on board with coming in before notice to proceed, before some of this stuff is done and fund. And it's oftentimes it's when they've done a number of transactions together, an investor will be more willing to invest earlier on because they know what they're getting into. But like even on these New York projects, there's probably about $25,000 worth of development cost that these guys have to get into. And what they did was they put together a line of credit that allowed them to do that, as well as get good terms on the cost of that testing. And so there are strategies around that. We're happy to talk to you and work with you on how to go about that. We're happy to introduce you to the right people to get development capital, et cetera. But yeah, at the end of the day, it does end up being at risk in many cases.
So what else should installers and developers know to successfully sell PPAs? We install quite a few PPAs. We don't self-develop them. We build them for other developers, and like C2 Energy Capital from New York and PSG from Indiana. And so we eat that work up, but it's non-trivial developing a PPA with a customer.
I think the only other thing I would say, and this seems silly in some respects, but at the same time, it's a real thing, is use tier 1 equipment. Even if you can get off-brand panels for 20 cents a watt, that may not stand up with the investors. They need to know that the warranties are bankable and that the debt and tax equity that are going to be helping finance this can allow those panels or inverters or what have you to be included on their approved vendor list that they have to follow. And it's not as often that I see that, but everybody's trying to do these systems as cheaply as possible. And so we do say go with the tier 1 brands because they're always bankable. And so that's a key thing. But everything that you and I have talked about today, people can find that on our website, especially in those blog posts. They're there because we want to get this kind of content out to you guys. I've got some more content planned, stuff about how we do our valuations or how the industry does valuations, talking about credit, all that stuff. But otherwise, people should just reach out and come talk to me. I'm happy to have a conversation any day of the week.
Something we haven't really touched on is the buyout. There is often a buyout clause in these contracts, because the sweet incentives are used up oftentimes in 5 to 10 years, right?
Yep.
And then the value of the equipment is quite low, and it's much cheaper for the host to buy the system out. Do you want to make any comments about that?
Yeah, I mean, in the PPA that we use, that we've helped structure, and in most PPAs that we've seen, there's often a buyout clause early. So usually it's year 7, and year 7 is a year that they use because that's when the tax equity investor is out. That's when all of the depreciation has been used, recapture is over, et cetera. And by year 7, the cost to buy out a system is often significantly lower. There's in some PPAs, there's a year 7, there's a year 15, there's year 20. They will have specific points for the buyout, but most PPAs will also have just a termination values list, which is if for whatever reason you want to terminate the contract, this is what it's going to cost to buy it out at any point in time. And there are some customers who make it very clear, we want to buy out this contract. They don't always do it, but we will always share with a customer who's interested in a buyout. We will always share what that value is going to be. When we get to a point where a customer is ready to move forward, we actually provide a PPA term sheet that walks through the general terms of the PPA, the key items that a customer needs to see, the price, the term, escalators if there are any, what happens with cash incentives, but also what the termination timeline is, when you can buy out the system and what that value might be. So, we will provide as much information as we can to help support the developer, to help make that sale, to help keep that customer comfortable, because they need to know that, hey, if we're going to plan for this, we need to know exactly how we want to plan for this.
I know one of the concerns that hosts have is, well, what happens if in 10 years the price of grid energy goes down significantly? And here I am holding this long-term PPA with an escalator of 1.5 or 2%. How do you answer that question?
So it's a hard question to answer because none of us have a crystal ball. And the answer is that is a risk that we've seen utilities restructure completely. ComEd restructured 7 years ago because they were getting beaten by all the retail energy providers. And now they have a different pricing structure. But if you look that on average, even looking from 20 years ago with the restructuring, ComEd's still gone up 2.5% each year, based on its average growth rate. And so, what I would say is that oftentimes, if you're going to have a big drop in utility price because something happens, that as long as your escalator is lower than your utility escalator, and that there's enough room in the pricing. So let's say you have a 10% discount to the grid rate, and then the grid rate is growing at 2.5% and you're growing at 2%. Well, you started at 10%, and then you're going to grow 0.5% every year of price difference between you and the utility. So 10 years from there, you're going to be at 15% difference. So I've never heard of a utility dropping 15%, but if it happened, you'd still be at break even. Now, if that happened and you were above the grid rate, there are often clauses in the PPA to deal with that. But, at the end of the day, it ends up being a negotiation as to how do we proceed with you, the customer, and us, the investor and owner of the system. And at that point, it may just make more sense to buy out the system and and be out of that than anything else.
That's where I go, is just, yeah, just buy it out. And then you've dealt with that, so to speak, really. But
Yeah.
well, we just have a couple minutes, Micah. Is there anything else you want our viewers to know? And certainly tell us how people can reach you.
Yeah, absolutely. The best way to reach me is by email. My email address is msussman at New Resource Solutions. So first initial, last name at New Resource Solutions. I'm always available. And then as soon as you reach out, let's set up a time to talk. It's the funny part of my job is that you talk to my wife and she'll tell you that I spend all this time on the phone and she has no idea what else I do. So it's
Well, I can attest. I can attest, Micah. You're very easy to work with. You're very responsive. So, do not hesitate to reach out to New Resource Solutions. And I mean, there are many PPA vendors in this country. The question is, who's going to be the right fit culturally for you, and have the same sense of urgency. So it takes a little poking the bear, and trying different options on, and the pricing is different, of course, with different companies as well. So um you just
and
got to find the right fit.
that's one of the best things about us is that we're not the investor, but we work with enough investors that say your project doesn't work for investor A, but it works for investor B, but or investor B and C, and we can then go and talk to the one that we think is going to make the most sense. Maybe we need somebody who can handle a specific type of off taker. We have access to those investors. We work with those investors, and they know that when we come to the table, that we're not coming to the table with a half-baked answer for them. We do the work, we get it done, and they like what they see from us.
Very good. Well, I just want to make a couple of announcements for our viewers and listeners. Please go to cesnrg.com/videos or /podcast. We do have live events that are pre-registered, so check those out at the podcast page. And then all of our content is on the /videos landing page. Please subscribe to our YouTube channel. Give us a thumbs up. Share with your friends and colleagues. We're really trying to grow the channel. And so if you appreciate this content, please subscribe and share it. I'm Tim Montague. Let's grow solar and storage. I want to thank you, Micah Sussman with New Resource Solutions, for coming on the show.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me.
Have a great day, everybody.